I am Romy Newman. I'm the co-founder of Fairy GodBoss. Fairy GodBoss, if you don't know, is the largest career community for women. And we were just saying over 1 million women use Fairy GodBoss a month. And we are so, I always love having a chance to collaborate with Jen Tardy, who I believe is 100% one of the smartest thinkers in the diversity recruitment space. And so I feel 100% confident you are all going to learn something today and feel very wowed. Jen, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into this work?
I so appreciate you, and thank you, and to Fairy GodBoss for bringing me here. So I am Jen Tardy. I'm the founder and CEO of Jennifer Tardy Consulting, or we call ourselves Team JTC. And we actually work with two different audiences. We work with job seekers, so people who are on their job search. And the easiest way to explain what we do is we help people to navigate the bias that hides in the hiring process. And then the other audience that we work with are employers, and we help employers to implement effective diversity recruiting programs. And we do that through training and also consulting. Our whole team, we're a team of people who geek out over over learning new things about how to increase diversity and then sharing that. And so my background is recruiting. I'm a recruiter at heart. I actually grew up in recruiting over the last 15 years, from recruiting all the way up to leading recruiting leaders. And then in 2017, I started Jennifer Tardy Consulting. 2018, I left the workplace, and here we are today. And so we're a learning-oriented company. So everything we learn, we just put it back out there.
Love it. Well, we're all learning, I think, especially because the world is changing and last year's rules just don't even apply anymore. So I know you're all excited to hear from Jen, and I am too. But before we do, I'm actually going to share some new research that Fairy GodBoss has released about the state of diversity recruiting in 2022. Some interesting findings and takeaways here that I hope will be valuable to you and kind of help set a tone for our conversation as well. So without further ado, we conducted this survey among 150 leaders like you all in the audience, leaders in TA, employer brand, and diversity. And you can kind of see the job title makeup there. About half by kind of by coincidence, about half are in technology or computer software. And you can kind of see the distribution of company size below. Just gives you a sense of where this data came from. So the first question we asked is, how many of you have specific or tangible goals for diversity recruiting in 2022? And before I even show you the data, I always think this question is so interesting because when we started Fairy GodBoss way back in 2015, I think no one had specific targeted goals for diversity recruitment. It just was not a thing you had. And so it's been really interesting to watch that discipline and that kind of that metric grow. Now, we asked in 2021, so that's our first year of benchmarking, 55% said they had it. That grew to 61% that had it. Jen, do you feel like that's consistent with what you see out there?
That's very interesting. And I was so excited because I don't know this data yet, meaning I don't know what you're going to show on the next slide. And so I was like, I wonder how many. It feels right. Now, here's what's interesting. Oftentimes, if I were to actually sit and talk to recruiters, my question to them would be, do you know where you're underrepresented? And do you know who you're looking for? And so when I hear people say that, yes, it's growing and more people are talking about diversity recruiting, I still wonder if it still wouldn't surprise me if there's still a lot of confusion around where they're underrepresented and who they really should be targeting to increase representation.
Yeah, and I would add to that, even like, are these goals that they've set reasonable?
Yes,
right?
yes.
Go
Are they
from
realistic
20% to 50% this week.
Yes,
right.
Exactly. And I also, most of the goals that are being set that I've observed are being set outside of the recruiting team. Someone is sharing with them, here's what your targets should be, and then recruiters are going after, or at least trying to fill those positions that way. And so it's a tough balance.
For sure. This will not surprise you at all, but number one, function, technology. We see a lot of sales or customer service, non-tech engineering, which has grown considerably in the last year, marketing, finance, other areas. So last year, just 50% of the companies in our study said they had a chief diversity officer. It grew by 2 percentage points this year. I'm not exactly sure what to make of that. I'm surprised that more don't, to be honest with you.
Here's what's interesting too. So LinkedIn just released a jobs report for 2022. And what we're seeing is that over the last 2 years, organizations have been hiring chief diversity officers, head of DEI, just like you have on there. And now those same organizations are starting to expand their teams. And so one of the positions that they're seeing on the top 25 list are like diversity and inclusion managers or program managers. And even taking it a step further, we're also starting to notice that that you're seeing positions that's almost a hybrid position that has 1 foot in DEI and 1 foot in recruiting as well too. So people are trying to figure out how to do this work.
Yes,
But yeah.
I've definitely also seen that there's sort of like a new title, diversity recruit.
Yes, yes, exactly.
But this was interesting too. In the survey, this is a little bit squishier, but 63% said their company has invested more funding and resources toward improving diversity compared to 2021. Which is nice to see that this is an ongoing trend and not sort of a flash in the pan.
I agree.
This is small, and so I'm going to focus on the big pieces here. But the question was, okay, what are you doing? Right? So almost 80% conducting unconscious bias training. And Jen is a phenomenal trainer of this if you need someone. Gender neutral job descriptions has really grown considerably. Compensation audits have become much more prevalent, and diversity employee referral programs have grown considerably as well.
Oh, someone actually said I'm in one of those roles as well as the DEI program manager. See, Patricia, you get it.
There you go.
And what's so interesting as well too is that on the last slide, when it had shown that organizations are investing more, I started to say, I guarantee it starts with unconscious bias training, because every employer that I talk to, when I'll ask, well, what have you been doing so far? Oh, we've done unconscious bias training, which isn't enough, but it's a great start.
Exactly. Yeah, for sure. Oops. Okay. So then this one I thought was interesting because we talk all the time to leaders in TA or employer brand. They say, oh, we need to get more diverse candidates. But then I always am amazed that so many of them can't even measure, right? So we've got companies that say we need 50% of our candidates to be women, but only, just over half of companies can measure the gender of their applicants. 60% are measuring the gender of their hires, or diversity data about their hires, right? And this is definitely so last year when we did this, we talked a lot about how there needed to be improvements and investments in data capture so that we could even deliver better results. But I think we've seen progress, right? We went from 17% overall not capturing diversity data to 9% in 2022. But clearly, in order to have a really robust understanding of what's happening in the funnel, there's still a lot of data lacking for a lot of companies.
Right. And you also have a lot of, one of the other challenges as well too, is that there are a lot of organizations capturing data, but not analyzing it. And so it's one thing to have it, it's another thing to review it. And then it's another step to actually process and prove by it. And so that's where whenever I'm talking with employers, I'm trying to move the dial in that direction.
100%.
Because notice they said, some people said, I don't even know. Like they don't know if their company.
I don't know. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And to that point, when we said, if your organization isn't capturing this data, why not? 63% is, I don't have the tech. 26%, a lot of people still have discomfort or questions about what is allowed and how they can capture this data. And then 11% say, not a priority.
Yeah.
We talked about employer branding initiatives. And certainly we see that there's a few key employer branding efforts that are in place to help drive diversity recruiting, promoting employee resource groups. And I've been in other conversations, I'm talking so much about how in our virtual working world, these have become the linchpin of community for a lot of companies. Publishing a public statement about your company's commitment to diversity. Dedicating space to diversity efforts on your career page. Look at this one, 27% to 43%, publishing flexible work policies.
Is that more like remote work, right? And because, I remember when the pandemic first hit and people started working remotely, my message was good luck on getting teams back into the office, because once you get a taste of the flexibility that comes with the ability to work remotely, it's really difficult. And I think a lot of companies are experiencing that right now.
Yeah, I think for sure. And it's only going to get worse. All right, let's see. So, I talk a lot about this, and I think we've spoken about this before, but to me, it's all about making sure you have diverse slates. If you really want to achieve diverse hiring, first, you've got to have diverse slates. And I always like to point to this chart at the bottom half of the slide, which is from Harvard Business Review, showing that if a diverse slate is only effective if it's half diverse or even 3/4 diverse, right? Otherwise, the outlier almost always gets excluded.
Have you heard of why that is? It was so interesting to me. So, because I think I saw this exact article that you're talking about as well too. So the initial conversation is around the Rooney Rule, and the Rooney Rule is NFL policy that said that we're requiring you to at least have one. They're saying one minority in your interview slate in order to, or ethnic minority, and before we'll start interviewing, right? And then they said, okay, well, the Rooney Rule isn't enough, so there needs to be more. And so with Harvard's study, they started talking about how, let's look at women and men, right? And the more women in this example that you add into the candidate slate, it begins to shift the perception of those who are interviewing, especially in roles that are dominated by men, right? And so it's not enough to shift those implicit biases that we have, that in this example, that men should be doing this role. You actually have to change the look of the slate that begins to do something psychologically to us to say, oh yeah, women can do this role. And that's what's happening in scenarios like this. It's so interesting, the psychology.
Changing the paradigm.
Yes, yes.
So when we did the survey in 2021, 28% of companies reported that they were enforcing diverse slates in recruiting, now up to 36%. I mean, if you're going to ask me what can every company do to drive diversity in their hiring, to me, this is the one. I think creating a structure that recruits and presents diverse slates makes all the difference.
And I just posted I just posted on LinkedIn about diverse candidate slates yesterday. Now, because there's something going on in the NFL right now, I am not a sports person. I don't remember names. So if people want to drop stuff into the comments, but there's a lawsuit right now. And yes, I knew people were listening. Brian Flores, right? Yes.
Everybody needs this
where he is now suing a couple of teams because he's now seeing that he was a part of one of these slates. And that's when they were talking about the Rooney Rule. Now, so this is a clear example of if you're using these mandatory diverse candidate slates in a performative way, right, in an optical way, only to check a box, this is where it can go wrong, and this is where it goes downhill for organizations. But if you're, yes, a class action against the NFL, yes. And so what's happening is he now was privy to a text message thread where someone was congratulating him, but they had the wrong Brian. And he's like, wait, I haven't even been interviewed yet. I'm supposed to be interviewed. It's bonkers to me because if you're doing this, you have to do it with intention, and you have to do it the
You
right way.
actually consider the candidates against each other,
You have
right?
to consider, you have to still fairly consider all the candidates and
Yeah.
hire the most competitive. There's no way to do that if you're already saying, I'm going to hire this other person, and you haven't even interviewed the whole slate. It's so interesting. Okay.
Oof, I missed that. So I'm glad everybody.
So I missed it too. Someone literally sent me an email. Someone said, Jen, have you seen this? Because again, I don't follow sports. But the moment I was like, let me read this whole thing right here.
So the sort of converse of the diverse slate is the diverse panel. And I know in a bit when we do Q&A, Jen, we're going to talk a lot about like what kind of organizations do people who value diversity want to work at. And the panel that you put in front of candidates is so important. So we have 64% of companies saying they're making sure that there's a diverse panel to interview candidates, 32% not, 12% not even sure.
Okay.
I'm going to skip this, and I'm going to skip about Fairy GodBoss, and I'm going to go right to our Q&A, because I know we're so excited to hear from you. Now, so I have some prepared questions, and then I'm going to throw it out to all of you. But let me just pull up my notes here. Okay, so. Okay. So we talked about how there are now all these 62% of companies say, I'm setting goals to achieve in terms of diversity recruiting. Do you see this? And what do you see underlying this in the companies?
Yeah, so a couple of years ago, I'd probably say 2020 and 2021, organizations were trying to figure out, they were moving the needle to confirm that they needed to do more to increase diversity, right? And what does that mean? What does that look like? And they started discovering that, yes, it requires a relationship and a partnership between the DEI office and the talent acquisition team. It requires that type of relationship. I think what we're seeing now in 2022 is that they're working on how to make this happen. And so this sort of goes back to what I was sharing earlier about you're starting to see more hybrid roles. And with those hybrid roles, it's requiring one person, and give me a +1 if you are in this role and you understand this, but it's requiring one person to understand two major functions, to understand what it means to recruit and how to recruit, the technical pieces of it, and what it means along the lines of, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how you bring those two pieces together. And I know that that's a very difficult, yes, Catherine, I see you said that's me. Yeah, Abigail. And I know that's a very difficult role because that's the space that I live in. It literally required me to leave corporate America to with all of the experience that I had in recruiting, and to dive deeply into diversity, equity, and inclusion, just to come back over to recruiters and say, now, here's what I want to teach you in context to the work that you're doing.
Great.
Another model DEI roles, specialized focus areas. Yep.
And Darlene's asked, and I think it's a good question, why do you think the number of companies with these specific goals has grown? What is the driving factor?
Accountability. People are holding organizations accountable for increasing diversity. And you're starting to see candidates say, I'm not going to come and work for you if I don't think that you're committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And you're also starting to see customers say, I don't want to do business with an organization that doesn't believe in this. And so it's the same thing as always. It's kind of like what's affecting your bottom line, and organizations tend to move the needle in spaces that really affect their bottom line, and increasing diversity is what's doing that as well.
Right. Or, the NASDAQ, right, won't list a company.
Oh, right.
Happens,
Exactly.
but let's see if that really goes through, but won't list a company unless they're diverse, right? Okay, great. So the next thing I was going to ask you, okay, so if for those of you on this call, and there are so many, what are the most impactful things, Jen, that you think this audience can be doing? If they were get off the phone and like they have these goals, diversity recruiting goals, what are the first things they need to do?
Yeah. So one of the things that I found is, so one of the questions that I often ask, especially in the beginning, is why aren't more people leaning into this work? And this work being diversity, equity, and inclusion, or increasing diversity. And what I found is that people need to feel qualified, capable, and comfortable. And so if you think about it this way, think about the last conversation that you didn't engage in because maybe you didn't feel like you knew enough about the conversation. You didn't want to use the wrong language. You didn't want to get any backlash and all of that. And so you just disengaged from the conversation. Well, the same thing is happening in the workplace as well, too, specifically as we start talking about recruiters and hiring managers. Without giving people the right language to use to do this work, without helping through training your recruiters and your hiring leaders to feel qualified, capable, and comfortable in doing this work, no one's going to be fully engaged in doing it. So to your question, what is the very next thing that that I would recommend for organizations that are trying to increase diversity? Make sure that those who are on your front lines are trained, that they have the right language, that they are understanding where they have internal resistance so they can work through their own internal resistance, that they know that recruiters and hiring managers know how to work together to deliver upon this work as well too. That's a big topic. We can talk about that later, but
Well, I was going to go there right now.
Oh, awesome.
With all due respect to the hiring managers on this webinar, often it's the hiring manager cited as an obstacle for the recruiters.
Yes.
What can you talk a little bit about how to improve that relationship or outcomes through that relationship?
One of the number one requests that I get from employers is, Jen, can your team come in and help our I get so caught up in looking at the chat box. I'm like, if only we can recruit without hiring managers. Okay. So one of the most requested things is Jen, can you please help our hiring managers and our recruiters work better together? And so what tends to happen is increasing diversity is not just about what we must start doing. It's also about the actions that we have to stop doing because these actions are creating an obstacle course for people to try to get into your organization. And so in this example, you may have recruiters who are doing the work to source and to attract people to want to come in to apply to open opportunities. But then those same resumes are going through the hiring process and they may be getting rejected by the hiring manager, or maybe you have people interviewing that aren't great interviewers and are creating issues with people even wanting to continue the interview process. And so there are all these hurdles that are happening within the hiring process. And now through inclusive recruiting, they're saying, hey, recruiters, we'll just go and talk to your hiring managers and just make sure that they do what they need to do so that they're not creating barriers. And recruiters are saying, wait a minute, me? Do you want me to talk to my hiring manager about what they need to stop doing? And so recruiters aren't feeling empowered to have those conversations. And many of the recruiters that we talk to or that we've trained have said, how they've been conditioned as recruiters to be easy to do business with, right? And this whole idea of being easy to do business with is in direct opposite of, but I need you to disrupt bias in the hiring process. Well, as a recruiter, how am I supposed to disrupt hiring bias if I'm supposed to be easy to do business with and I'm supposed to treat my hiring manager like a customer?
Right. And add to it like time to fill, cost to hire. And now you want to slow those things down. You want to ding those metrics so we can drive diversity.
Yes. And so one of the things that we teach recruiters is this idea of being a partner to your hiring manager versus seeing your hiring manager as a client, versus seeing your hiring manager as a customer. You have to learn to be a partner to them, and being a partner to a person, you both have accountability in the process. Recruiters are accountable for something, hiring managers are accountable for something, and we're going to keep holding each other accountable. Now, The only other piece that I'll say about this too, because this is a big topic in and of itself, is this idea of how do I disrupt bias if it's coming from the hiring manager? And so it's easy to say, well, just call them out when that happens, or call her out, or call them out when that happens. But we don't, at JTC, we don't like using the whole idea of calling people out because it can be distracting. So we really focus on the art of calling a person in. What does it look like to call a person in? And so when we talk about calling a person in, we talk about asking more questions. So first, it's assuming positive intent, that if I thought that my hiring manager really wanted to increase diversity, then what else could be the problem? So that's the first question, leaning in with positive intent, and then asking more questions. Okay, hiring manager, I see that you said no to this person. Why did you reject this person? Well, I just didn't have a good gut feeling about them. Okay, well, let's unpack this gut feeling for a second. Can you lean more closely to the job description and share with me which of the qualifications did they not meet that gave you that gut feeling? Okay, well, has anyone also shared with you that bias really lives in this whole gut feeling approach, right? And so it's asking those questions and then connecting it back to how it's creating an obstacle course to increase diversity. That's the art of calling people in at a very high level.
Love it.
Long answer to a short question.
No, such an important question. I'm going to shift the conversation a little bit. And then, so one last question for me, and then there's so many questions coming from the audience. I'm going to start to take those. So if you have questions, please start putting them in Q&A. But I'm going to just turn it on its head a little and talk about the other side of the work you do, Jen, and ask, what are women and job seekers that are of historically underrepresented backgrounds, what are you seeing them looking for now? How do you think companies can do a better job of fulfilling their needs and attracting them?
Yeah, so whenever, and I'm intentional about working with people who are on the job search, so I can hear real time their real stories. And one of the things that I would hear quite often when I'm doing group coaching is that I would hear job seekers say, well, I just want to make sure the company that I go to is a great company. Okay, great. Or they would say, I want to work in a great work environment. Okay, great. But then it started coming up so much, I started saying, well, let's unpack what a good work environment is for you. And to some people, that's when we started discovering that that people just want to work in a safe work environment. Okay, so what does safety look like for you? So safety looks like that if I speak up or voice my opinion, that I'm heard, that I understand what it takes to get to the next level, that that I see people who identify similarly to me within the organization, that I'm not experiencing microaggressions. And so what's happening now is that job seekers want more transparency. And they want this transparency so that they can find proof that the company is committed to doing the work to create inclusion, to promote belonging, and to increase diversity in particular. They're looking for proof of that right now.
Yeah, I think 100%. Authentic. They're looking for good intentions, good values, and companies that are putting money and effort behind those intentions.
Yep. Can you protect my work experience? Yep. If I were to truly bring my whole self to work, will I be working in a safe work environment? And this whole idea of a safe work environment is, if I did trust you, employer, and I brought all of me authentically onto the job, will I still be able to get a promotion? Will you still take me seriously?
Right.
You know, and so that also creates safety as well too.
I'm smiling because I think I mentioned this when we prepped, but we did a survey of Fairy GodBoss users about what the number one thing they were looking for in a job, and it was to be treated like a human being. And I thought, I mean, that's true, but it feels like a low bar.
It's the simplest things, you know? So that is very interesting.
Yeah. I'm going to take some of the questions from the audience. There are so many, and I love that. Some of them are just sort of definitional, so I just want to get these out of the way. Somebody said, "What's a slate?" That's a candidate slate. That's a new term for me.
So great question. So you already know there's a candidate pool. And so it's the people who are applying to the position and getting considered for that position. But as you continue to move candidates along the journey from being screened to being interviewed, the actual final set or group of candidates in recruiting, they often consider those interview slates or candidate slates. So it's whatever the final pool of candidates are that are making it to the final round of interviews. I paraphrased that, but yes.
Right. What is the best way? So there's a lot of questions, I think a handful of questions about collecting diversity demographic data and when and how that's legal. And also this question is, when is the best way to legally collect it without deterring candidates? At what point in the process and how?
Yeah, that's a big question. And I'm actually going to answer this question from a US-centric standpoint, because I know that globally there are different laws around self-ID programs. But if you haven't heard of a self-identification campaign, is what it's typically called, many organizations have it, but they're specifically focused on current employees, where they'll ask employees to voluntarily self-identify things such as race, ethnicity, gender, veteran status, disability status, all of that great information. And now what I spend a lot of time doing is encouraging employers to also do that very same self-ID campaign within their hiring process as well. And so when someone is submitting an application, when you're actually going to submit an application, one of the steps to submitting the application is voluntarily answering those questions. And what I've actually seen some organizations doing as well is that even within there, they're asking candidates to tell us your pronouns as well too. I'm like, oh, that's lovely. And so it creates a better candidate experience. Now, some of the work that we're doing on our end, specifically when we're talking to job seekers, is we're trying to help job seekers to understand why employers are collecting this information, because you have to remember that historically some employers weren't doing the right things by that information, and they were using that information to decide who they did not want to move forward in the hiring process. And so I can understand the trepidation that some job seekers have around it. And so now, if we're able to get more job seekers to voluntarily self-identify, then it gives employers an opportunity to look at the data. Let's even just look at historical data and say, what's happening within our hiring process? Where are candidates leaking out, meaning getting rejected or withdrawing from our hiring process? And then let's look at it demographically, right? And so are we seeing any patterns in this information, and what can we do about it? And so I think too, as long as employers are being very transparent about why they're requesting the data, how they plan to use the data, I think that information is going to go a long way with helping people to feel safer to self-identify.
In many ways, as I'm thinking about this, both kind of in this context, but also as an employer myself, we have a pretty thorough kind of process that we internally have documented to drive diverse slates and make sure we capture data so we can field diverse slates. And I think if we were better at sharing that information up front, everybody would sort of understand how we run our process and why we're collecting information.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I also think too, there's another part, whenever I talk about self-ID programs, there's also another part of the conversation too on who needs to have access to that information, because there's not everyone needs to have access to how people are identifying, like what's the real business reason that certain groups want access to it. And so if you have departments where you have like a recruiting department and the recruiters are working with hiring managers, in those situations, there's no business need for hiring managers to have access to demographic information, right? The business reason in that context that recruiters should have access to demographic information is how else are you going to determine if you have a well-represented candidate pool or candidate slate, because that's what recruiters are let me just say one quick thing, and then I'll get off of my
Yeah,
soapbox
no,
for a
get on
second.
it. We love, that's why you're here.
So when it comes to who's accountable for what, I always like sharing this. When you have a recruiting department and hiring managers in that partnership, recruiters are not responsible or accountable for the level of diversity within the organization. Recruiters are accountable for the level of diversity within the candidate pool. So
Yes.
you can only hold people accountable for the things that they have control over. And because recruiters are not in those scenarios making the final hiring decision, you don't hold them accountable for that. You hold them accountable for the level of representation within the candidate pool, which is also why it's important that recruiters also have access to that information as well too.
Yeah, they're glad you said that.
Yay, I always feel like I set recruiters free when I say that. Now, and then hiring managers on the other end are responsible for making sure that they hire the most competitive candidate. Let me say this in a different way. Hiring managers are accountable for removing their bias so that they're able to hire the most competitive candidate overall, period. And that is how an effective diversity recruiting program works.
Yeah, 100%. So kind of going on down this path about the slates, Oriana asked, how do you, or why would you establish diverse slates when the positions are really hard to fill? You know, when like these purple unicorns who know how to code only in 3 languages 6 times, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
When
So
they say it's hard, they can barely get one qualified candidate.
so you know how sometimes what is that saying that make sure that you're solving the problem and not the symptom of the problem? And sometimes we're diagnosing things by the symptoms. The problem when it comes to, and I'll say this in a different way. People often say that, oh, when you add on the layer of diversity recruiting, it just takes the process so much longer. That's not a diversity recruiting problem. That's a workforce planning problem. Let me say this again. That's not a diversity recruiting problem. That's a workforce planning problem. You would run into that same issue if you were trying to fill positions with people from specific colleges, but you haven't planned those relationships with those colleges in particular. Now, on the other end too, we also have to make sure, you know, that we're diagnosing it well on what's actually taking so long. Is it the fact that you're trying to increase diversity with the candidate slates, or is it the fact that your job description has 15 qualifications in it, right? Right. Does it take 15 qualifications for a person to be qualified to do this work successfully? And that is a big deal. Back on my soapbox for one more second. This is one of the things that I spend a lot of time talking to hiring managers about when I'm training hiring leaders, is that if we can rethink this idea of who is qualified, of what qualified means, then we will truly move the needle. And what tends to blur the lines on who's qualified is that we begin interviewing, we began thinking that people must come packaged in a specific way in order to be qualified. But if we begin challenging that thinking and asking a more important question, can they do the job? Okay, maybe they have long locks in their hair. Can they do the job? Okay, maybe they have long fingernails. Can they do the job? Okay, maybe they didn't make eye contact with you. Can they do the job? Right? And so when you begin asking the question, but can they do the job? It shows us more and more and more just how we keep saying that you're not qualified unless you come packaged in a certain way, come with a certain pedigree, come from a certain school, come, you know, from a certain network, all of that great stuff. So,
Yeah,
all right, I'm back off of it again.
I told, when we prepped, I told you I would tell this story, right? And I will, because I think it's a good one, because it isn't, there's always, of course, the physical appearance issues, yes, but I started my career at a large cosmetics company. And they had 3 different categories of business: fragrance, skincare, and marketing, right? And I started in fragrance, and I mean, I'm right out of college, right? And I did a couple of years in fragrance, and I wanted to move into makeup. And they said, no, you don't have enough experience to move into makeup. You don't have makeup experience. And I'm like, but I just got here. B, I'm pretty sure that what I did in fragrance could be applied, folks. But I think what happens is people get so narrow and specific about what qualified means, right? Or what,
Yes.
that they have a hard time imagining like this for that.
Yes, absolutely. And because I've shared that, ask yourself almost like an affirmation, but can they do the job? But can they do the job? I've actually shared that with hiring managers before. So like one of my favorite case studies is of this. I had one person that came through one of our training programs for hiring leaders. And he heard me say, but can they do the job? And so later he was conducting interviews, and he realized during the interview that he's so used to thinking that the type of person who would be great in the job would be packaged like he was when he was that age, right out of college, showing up like this, and this. And because this person didn't come packaged through that lens of how he saw himself at that time, he almost said no, that he wasn't going to extend her an offer. But then he found himself asking the question, can she do the job? And I don't mean just in a mediocre way. Can they do the job successfully? And then he said that when he knew that his answer was yes, and for the first time he was able to see his own bias in real action. And so she got the job, and she's very successful at the job. And I was like, oh, this is such a great case study here.
Yeah, exactly. It is. Related to the challenge of the purple unicorn, there have been a few questions about easier to stage diverse slates and drive kind of diversity through the process and the entry levels. And as you get higher through the ranks, people are finding it harder. Any thoughts or commentary on that?
So my first thought is one of the reasons it's harder is because what I found as a recruiter is that the higher the level of position, the job descriptions, those qualifications get longer. So, right. So it's a part of it is let's go back and let's look at the qualifications and what does it truly take to do this job at any level. And then if you begin to remove the politics around it as well, I mean, the higher you go up in organizations, the more this idea of having the right package, being packaged in a specific way, the more prevalent that actually becomes.
Sure.
And then
Yes.
The more I began hearing employers say, oh, well, I'm hiring an executive at this level, so they only can come from this industry. But then there are only 3 companies in your industry. I'm like, wait a minute. So then that's when we again begin unpacking this idea of what does qualified look like? Let's really have a conversation about this. Can you only be qualified by only coming from this specific industry? And or are there industry adjacent jobs or right? And people
like
always ask
fragrance
me
and makeup.
Yes. People always ask me for an example about like, industry adjacent. And another example that I give is that you may have the banking and finance industry, but then industry adjacent would be like fintech. Yeah. Right. So people making technology for, the banking industry or something like that. Those are industry adjacent jobs. And especially in larger organizations, you'd be surprised at people's career path and what got them to where they are today. And so if you begin looking at people who are entering our company, where are they coming from? People who are leaving our company, where are they going to? People who are accepting job offers, what job offers did they decline? People who are declining our job offers, what job offers did they accept? Now you begin to broaden this idea of a talent pool. So a lot of people keep thinking about a talent pool as only my competitors. No, you have to think about talent as where's your talent coming from? And I guarantee it's outside of your industry too.
It's such a good point. Going to a slightly different topic here. SW is asking, when we talk about the hiring managers and we are trying to recommend framing the conversation to leaders to interview in instead of interviewing candidates out. Leaders believe that shifting the requirement so they don't feel like they're settling to as it relates to diverse talent. I don't know if I can totally understand this question.
But you know, it's very interesting. So even if I don't get this right, I think I still have some thoughts around it.
Yeah.
So thank you for pulling up that one.
Yeah.
So it's this idea of, am I having to lower my standards in order to increase diversity? And
I think
right, is that
I
kind
think
of
you nailed the gist of the question. Yes.
Perfect. Because I get this question so often. It's this idea of, in order to increase diversity, I have to lower my standards, which is a myth that I'm typically providing clarification on. It's not lowering your standards. It's rethinking this idea of what qualified actually looks like. You've added way too many factors that's making your job exclusive, right, to people who could naturally do the job successfully.
Yes.
And it's even it's little things like the type of language that you use, or we were talking earlier about including gender neutral language. Yeah. Because if I see something about, you know, aggressive and you have to be willing to whip them into shape and all, and I'm like, that sounds dangerous.
Yeah.
You know, and who are you signaling for this job? So I would stay focused on, it is very important to us as an organization to have the most competitive people. Bless you. To have the most competitive people. But what we also have to do is stop being a roadblock to getting the most competitive people. And the way that we're being a roadblock to that is through all of these qualifications that are no indicator to how successful you can be at this job.
Yeah, I agree. All right, Ebony asked this. So kind of going back to this idea of different points in the hierarchy, right? More senior roles. Her question is, how do you get inbound interest? How do you attract candidates at the senior level, because it's so competitive and they're often being headhunted and not even searching on job boards? What do you do if you're trying to draw in applicants at those stages?
So there are two things that I love talking about. I hope I don't forget one while I'm talking about the other one. So one is signaling, right? Who are you signaling when through all of your employer branding efforts? So for instance, if I go to your career page, or even if I go to your social media page and I don't see any conversations about things that would matter to me, right? Then I don't think you're looking for me. And so I'm going to say that very generically on purpose, right? So who are you actually signaling? And then
it's like marketing, right? I want to know that this is targeted toward me.
Yes, because so like for me, for instance, if I'm looking at job opportunities and I'm looking at your career page, for example, and I'm looking at your team photos and stuff, and I see things like this is for me personally, if I see things like golf or country music, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, but it's like it's not a part of my lived experience. And so I'm thinking to myself, are they looking for me, right? Yes, if your business is golf, you absolutely have to have pictures of things of golf on there. But that's just one example, right? And this is just me personally. Or if you're talking all about sports, it does nothing for me. Like I don't know anything about, so I don't think you're signaling to me. So we have to begin thinking about where are we underrepresented, where are we trying to increase representation, and is our marketing material in our social media, is it signaling to that audience that in particular, that we are a space that believes in inclusion for them as well too. The second piece that I would say as well, that I've said to audiences a lot too, is that when you're underrepresented in specific areas and you're trying to increase representation in those areas, go to places that are overrepresented in the spaces where you are underrepresented. If you are underrepresented, for example, for hiring women, Fairy GodBoss is overrepresented for women, right? Right? And so, and what tends to happen is we'll go as recruiters, and again, I grew up in recruiting, so I know this feeling. When we have lots of positions that we're working to fill, we tend to go to spaces that we're always going to, the LinkedIns, right, for example. And so yes, and so when you're trying to be intentional, I want you to go to spaces that are overrepresented in areas where you're underrepresented. 2, add that to your strategy. Not instead of, but also do that.
All right, I'm going to ask you one more question because I think that's all we have time for. And there are so many good questions that I may not be able to answer. So what I want to say is that, is it okay, Jen, for me to say that you are reachable? You can,
yes, absolutely.
You are on LinkedIn, and everyone's going to get an email from Jen inviting you to sign up for her amazing newsletter and be in touch with her. So know that this does not have to be the last you hear from her. And I told you she's a font of knowledge and that this would happen. But so here's the last one I'm going to throw at you before we say goodbye. So, because I think this is true. So somebody said they're at an early stage, small organization that's not large enough to exhibit diversity at a meaningful scale, right? They have one Black employee, no women in leadership positions. So how do we communicate to candidates that we're committed to diversity when we're not diverse? And I think this person is asking this in the context of a small company, but I think the reality is this happens more in many companies of many sizes.
Yes,
so what would you recommend?
absolutely. So one of the things, I have a lot of thoughts around this, but I'll try to say a few. One of the things that I always first teach people when I'm giving workshops and things is that diversity is not because of me, diversity is because of us. So here's an example. I alone cannot be diverse, but we collectively, we are diverse, right? So, so diversity means variety. Now, one of the things that I share with leaders is that when you're in spaces like this, where maybe there is homogeneity among the population of people that are working in your company, you can still have conversations about increasing representation, understanding that you're underrepresented. You can have those conversations on social media. You can have those conversations within the organization. And what I think is happening right now, not even I think, I know, is that a lot of leaders are saying, hey, I know that our organization believes in diversity, equity, and inclusion. I know that we want to increase diversity. I just don't know specifically where I, as a leader, am accountable for helping to do this work. And so that's why we help organizations to build programs where everybody knows that they have a part and what their part is in that program, from ambassadors, from recruiters to ambassadors to even leaders. And so one of the activities that we share with leaders on what their role is in doing this work, especially if they're in an organization that that is a very homogenous organization, we will say, have conversations, talk, and then say, we believe in increasing representation. We know that we're underrepresented in these areas. We also have a lot of great job opportunities open. If you know someone, tell them to send me their resume. there's such power, whether we like it or not, that people have by way of their role and their title, that when they speak, people listen. If you can help your leaders to be more active in the communities that you're trying to recruit, to speak openly and to solicit referrals, send them on to them, and then have the leaders send you the resumes along the way. So that's a good start.
I love it. Jen, I knew this would be amazing, and it was. And somebody said this is one of the best webinars I've attended in a long time, and I tend to agree. Thank you very much for joining us, and we will share this. We'll send the recording, and you'll be Jen will be in touch with you so you can be part of her community as well. Thanks for joining today.